I rescued an injured Apache girl from the river. The next day, her father returned with an unexpected reward. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. By the time Nayati Redhawk stepped down toward the river, the sun had already dropped behind the ridgeline. The sky was fading into that flat, gray dusk, cold air sliding through the cottonwoods, dry leaves skittering across the trail behind him. He wore his long cavalry coat, buttoned tight collar, turned up against the wind rifle slung across his back. A man didn't come down to the river at this hour without a reason. He'd been out here alone for 5 long years. After the war, after losing Aylin Moonfeather and their boy Ahuli Grey Cub to fever that same cursed winter, Nayati had withdrawn from the world piece by piece. Now he kept to a one-room cabin he'd built with his own hands, raising a few cattle, mending his own boots, fixing fences nobody else ever crossed. The nearest settlement was half a day's ride. He only went in once every few weeks for coffee flour, tobacco, and salt. If he had a mission at all, it was survival, not just in body, but in spirit. Keep the days quiet. Keep the mind busy. No trouble, no company, no unexpected knocks at the door. Yet that night, the quiet felt wrong. Nayati stepped closer to the riverbank, 2 metal pails in hand, and stopped when he caught sight of a strange shape among the rocks downriver. Low, half-hidden behind driftwood and brush. He squinted. A smear of color where it shouldn't be. He set the pails down, unslung the rifle, and moved cautiously along the river's edge. Boots crunching gravel, heart thudding with that familiar unease, the kind that told him something bad had already happened. When he got close enough, he saw her, a young Apache woman, twisted over the rocks, one arm pinned beneath her. Dark hair, soaked skin, pale from cold. Her deerskin dress drenched through beadwork, muddied one side, torn where blood had dried into the fringe. Her leg bent at a bad angle. Her chest rose and fell, but only just. Nayati froze for half a second. He could have walked away. It would have been easier. Cleaner. He knew what kind of trouble helping an Apache woman could bring in this territory. Plenty of ranchers wouldn't even bury her, let alone bring her inside. But he wasn't most men. He'd seen enough bodies for one lifetime. He didn't want to see another one die, not if he could stop it. "God damn it," he muttered, and knelt. She didn't fight as he slid his arms beneath her, but she flinched when he adjusted her leg, groaning low and weak. Her skin was ice-cold against his arms. He lifted her carefully, avoiding the worst injuries, and carried her the half-mile back to the cabin. She weighed less than she should. He could feel every bone through the wet fabric. By the time he reached his front steps, his breath came in sharp clouds. He shifted her, managed the door latch with his shoulder, and brought her inside. The heat from the stove had faded to embers. He laid her on his bed, the only place soft and flat enough, and covered her with the second blanket. Then he threw on more wood, stirred the coals, and set the coffee pot full of water on the stovetop. The crackle of new flame broke the silence. Nayati crouched beside the bed, breathing hard from the hall. Her cheek was scraped, raw blood dried and cracked. He opened the small pine box on a shelf above the stove. Old Union Army remnants, a few wraps, a small bottle of carbolic acid, a clean needle, boiled thread. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He poured warm water into a tin bowl, cleaned the dirt from her leg, and carefully ran his hand along the bone. The ankle was likely sprained or fractured, but not shattered. He could splint it. Using 2 slats of wood from the kindling box, he wrapped them snugly. She didn't scream, but her breath hitched once, fingers tightening into the blanket. She hadn't spoken a word. Her eyes fluttered open once, while he cleaned the cut across her ribs. Deep brown eyes watching him without expression, just taking him in. When he finished dressing the wounds, he stepped back and looked at her. Still breathing, eyes still open, but no movement otherwise. He didn't expect thanks. He went to the stove, poured a little of the warm water into a tin cup, and set it on the crate beside the bed. He didn't force it into her hands, just placed it there. She turned her head slightly, looked at it, then at him. Why, she asked, voice hoarse, barely audible. The question hit harder than he expected. He thought about how many people he'd watched die in war. About the fever that took Aelin Moonfeather while he was out mending the fence. About a Hooly Grey cub who never made it past his 3rd year. And about the silence that had filled every corner of this cabin since. "Didn't feel right to leave you there," he said finally. She didn't say a word, but her eyes stayed open. Nayati Redhawk dropped into the chair by the stove, shrugged off his coat, and tugged off his boots with a sigh. He had no clue what she'd do come morning if she'd try to walk if someone out there was searching for her, or if by pulling her from the river he'd just welcomed trouble right into his front door. But he wasn't the kind of man to leave someone bleeding in the dirt. When the coffee pot hissed softly, he poured himself half a cup, and drank slow eyes, never drifting far from the still form under the covers. She looked small, almost fragile beneath the bulk of the blankets, but there was something in the way she held herself tight, alert, that told him she wasn't broken, just hurt. Same as him. He didn't sleep much that night, drifted in and out, always one ear open. The rifle stayed leaned near the door. Cabin sealed tight. She never stirred. Not until the first threads of dawn slipped through the warped glass and laid light across her face. Then her fingers shifted beneath the blanket, slow, deliberate. She was still there. And so was he. Sunlight crept into the room like a ghost stretching across the rough plank floor. The fire in the stove had burned down to glowing coals, but the place held enough warmth to keep off the cold. Nayati stirred in the chair back, aching neck stiff from sleeping upright. One hand still rested near the rifle, a habit he'd never broken. His eyes opened, locking instantly on the bed. She was awake now, not moving much, but her head had turned toward the window. Her fingers weren't clenched in pain anymore, they curled loosely at the edge of the blanket. She looked at him, and he straightened in his seat. For a long moment, neither spoke. Just stared across that small space between them. No questions, no fear. Just awareness. Nayati cleared his throat. It hurt more than expected. She blinked once, then, after a beat, gave the slightest shake of her head. He gave her a small nod in return and stood slowly, joints stiff from the cold and poor sleep. Without a word, he moved to the stove, tossed in more wood. Flames caught quick. The sound and motion calmed him, something familiar in a morning full of unknowns. He still didn't know who she was or what kind of danger might be trailing behind her, but the fact she hadn't run meant something. That counted. "I'll get coffee going," he said. "Got beans, too. Nothing fancy." She didn't answer, but her eyes tracked his every move, cautious, sharp, but not scared. He poured water into the pot and set it on the stove. Then he knelt back down beside the bed. Her leg was still swollen. The wrap had held overnight, but the cloth on her ribs needed changing. The wound was weeping. He knew that smell infection wasn't far off. "This'll sting," he said simply. He didn't explain more. Just peeled the bandage back slow and used the damp corner of a rag to clean around the gash. She hissed once, but didn't cry out. Her jaw tightened, fingers balling into the blanket. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and wired. "Name's Nayati," he said while working. "Redhawk. Used to scout for the Union. Been out here 6 years now. Alone. Still no reply, but something in her gaze shifted just a little. He packed the wound with the last of his carbolic and wrapped it tight again. Then he stood back and looked at her. "You got a name?" he asked. "Can't keep calling you girl." A pause. Then finally, soft but steady, she said, "Selu." He nodded once. "All right then, Selu." He returned to the stove. Beans were simmering in a small pot, thick and dark, seasoned with a scrap of salt pork he'd held back from last week's trade. Coffee was close to ready, too. The silence hung heavy while he fixed 2 tin plates, spooned beans into both, then carried one over and set it beside her. "You able to sit?" She tried. Propped herself up slowly with one elbow, teeth clenched through the pain. He didn't move to help, didn't want to spook her, but he hovered nearby just in case. She managed to get upright, breathing harder, but didn't complain. Took the plate, stared at it for a beat, then lifted the spoon. They ate in silence. She finished about half. He cleaned his plate. Then he set them both aside and poured 2 cups of coffee. Questions lingered like smoke, but Nayati didn't press her. Instead, he spoke plain. "You were out there alone, in the middle of nowhere, with a busted leg, half drowned. That doesn't just happen." She stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Ambush," she said finally. 3 men. I ran." He waited. "White men," she added with a nod. "Hired by traders. I was carrying a message. For a scout up north near the ridgeline. They saw me. Thought I was alone." "You were." Another pause. Her voice dropped. "Not at first." That was all she said. Nayati leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, planted his boots. He didn't say anything more. Not yet. But the wheels in his mind were already turning. He didn't press her. Not yet. Selu Rainbird had already said more than he ever expected. Nayati Redhawk glanced at her leg again. "You're not going anywhere for a while," he said plainly. "That ankle won't hold weight, let alone ride." Her eyes shifted toward the door, then back to him. Her voice came softer this time, like it cost something to ask. "Are you going to make me leave, Nayati?" Met her gaze head on. No. There was no big exhale of relief. She just nodded like she already knew, but needed to hear it spoken aloud. Still, he noticed a small shift in her body, a subtle easing in her shoulders. Maybe it wasn't trust just yet, but it was a start. Later that morning, Nayati stepped out to check the cattle, leaving the cabin door half-closed behind him. He didn't lock it, didn't tell her to stay put. If she wanted to run, she would. If she wanted to stay, she would. Outside, the wind had picked up again, threading through the cottonwoods like it was trying to whisper something he couldn't quite catch. He checked the fence line, counted heads, shoveled out the feed trough. Routine. Necessary. But the same thought kept circling in his mind. She never begged, never pleaded, never even asked for help. And yet she was still alive. A busted leg. Ambushed. Swept downriver. And she hadn't quit. He respected that. By the time he came back around noon, the coffee pot still sat warm on the stove, and Selu was asleep again. Wrapped in that old wool blanket of his face half turned into the pillow. She hadn't touched the rifle, hadn't moved much at all, just rested. Nayati settled back into his chair, eyes drawn to her once more. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or who might show up looking. But the quiet in the cabin didn't feel so heavy anymore, and for the first time in years, he didn't mind that. By mid-afternoon, the wind had died down, though the sky stayed a dull, washed-out gray, like smoke clinging to the ridgeline. The air carried the scent of wet bark and fading ash. Nayati stood outside, sleeves rolled up, splitting cedar near the woodshed. His axe hit steady and clean. Not rushed. Just working. From inside, he caught faint movements, the rustle of cloth, the creak of floorboards. Selu was awake again, and this time it sounded like she was trying to move on her own. He listened, but didn't interfere. Once the last log was stacked, he wiped his hands on a rag and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and simmering beans. She'd made her way to the edge of the cot, legs wrapped in the blanket, hair pulled back with her fingers the best she could manage. Her dress had dried some, though the tear on her side still showed where the wound had been. Nayati saw the effort it had taken just to sit up without flinching. But more than that, he saw how her eyes scanned the room. Not just out of curiosity, but like she was measuring what kind of man she'd ended up with. The rifle still leaned by the door. His tool bag lay open under the peg rail. Nothing had been touched. "You hungry again?" he asked. She gave a small nod. He ladled beans into a tin bowl, broke a piece of flatbread from the tin above the stove, and brought both over on a tray. She accepted the food, her hands steady now, and ate without hesitation. He leaned against the doorframe, arms folded across his chest, just watching her for a while. Then, to his surprise, Selu was the one to speak first. "You live out here alone?" she asked. "Since the war ended," he replied. "Had a wife, had a son." He looked down at his boots. Fever took them. Winter of 77. She didn't ask more. And for that he was grateful. He'd learned long ago most people filled silence too quickly with pity or empty talk or old stories they half remembered. But Selu let the silence sit. Let it mean something. "I was told not to come this far south," she said eventually, voice low. He didn't ask who warned her. "They were right," he muttered. "Too many men down here pull triggers before asking names." She tilted her head, studying him. "But not you." He held her gaze. "I asked." There was a long pause between them. Then her eyes dropped to the scar on his forearm, visible now where his sleeve had been rolled up. Old ragged, the kind of wound that came from steel, not powder. "You fought," she said. Twice, he nodded. "Army when I was 17, then again scouting with the Rangers near Colorado." He didn't finish the rest. He didn't have to. The look in her eyes said she understood. "I walked away when I'd seen enough of what folks call justice." Nayati Redhawk, said his voice low. "Now I raise cattle. Mend fence. Keep to myself." Selu Rainbird's gaze sharpened just a bit. "Then why carry me out of that river?" It was the same question, but this time it held weight. Not fear, but meaning. Nayati rubbed a hand along the edge of his jaw. He didn't try to soften the answer. "I didn't want to dig a grave for another stranger. That's it." She held his eyes for a moment, then returned to her meal without another word. Later that evening, while Selu rested again, he moved around the cabin quietly. Washed the tin cups, wiped the tabletop, stoked the fire with another armful of cedar. Then he unrolled his bedroll by the stove, not because he needed the heat, but to give her the cot without crowding her space. Not that there was much space to begin with in the one-room cabin. He checked the rifle, cleaned it. Then his revolver. Habit. He hadn't had to fire either in a long time. But something about her, the way she'd arrived, the condition she was in, had awakened old instincts he'd buried deep. And something else, too. A thought he hadn't voiced yet. Someone was looking for her. Not maybe. Definitely. She hadn't been wandering by accident. She'd been ambushed near the ridge. She was carrying something word-warning or both. He leaned against the doorframe as dusk fell over the valley, a pale blue, sinking into gray. The land stretched quiet, but his mind churned. He didn't know who she'd been running from, but he had a feeling they were closer than she wanted to believe. As the fire popped and cracked in the hearth, her voice came from the cot, low, steady. "I wasn't lying," Selu said. "When I told you I was alone, I am." He turned toward her. "My father sent me north, to speak with an ally, someone trying to stop a deal. Too many guns going out, not enough food coming in. He thought maybe there was still a chance to fix it." She paused. "They hit me before I even reached the pass. Ambush was already waiting. You think it was a setup?" he asked. "I know it was." He didn't answer right away, just stood there absorbing it. This wasn't just a woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was bigger, something twisted in backdoor politics, tribal alliances, trade routes poisoned by greed. And now she was bleeding on his cot. "You're not safe here long," he said finally. "If they're tracking you and find out a white man took you in—" "You can send me away," she interrupted, her voice flat. "I won't beg. I never said I would." She didn't reply, just stared into the fire. But he caught something in her jaw. That set tension like she'd braced for rejection. He'd seen that look before. Folks who'd heard no one too many times. He took a step closer. "This land's mine. This cabin's mine. You're not locked in here. Once you heal, if you want to ride out, you can." He paused, voice steady. "But if anyone comes sniffing around before, then I'll deal with it. You understand?" That got her attention. She looked up, met his eyes, not with surprise, but with something deeper. "Not thanks. Recognition? You're not like the others," she said. Nayati shrugged. "Not sure that means much." "It does," she replied quietly. Outside, the wind had crept back through the trees, low and steady like a drumbeat on the edge of the dark. Inside, neither of them spoke again, but something between them had shifted. The next 2 days passed without trouble, but neither Nayati nor Selu acted like peace could be trusted. Her fever had broken. Some color returned to her cheeks. The swelling in her ankle had eased. She still couldn't walk unaided, so Nayati whittled her a set of makeshift crutches from split pine and strapped them tight with old leather lacing. She took to them without a word of complaint. They kept a respectful distance in that tight cabin, not out of awkwardness, but understanding. Neither asked for more than the other was ready to give. And somehow that made it easier. Balanced. Each morning, Nayati rose early. He boiled coffee, checked the sky, walked the fence lines. But now when he returned, before he ever set his rifle down, he always looked toward the cabin first, just to make sure she was still there. He stood still, listening, attuned to every sound coming from inside the cabin. The shift of weight on old boards, the soft scrape of crutches, a cough. He didn't say it aloud, but something inside him had changed. And it wasn't just duty. That morning, Nayati Redhawk returned from the hill behind the barn, his boots dusted with frost and a sack of firewood slung over one shoulder. Selu Rainbird sat at the table, her legs propped out straight, mending her torn dress with a thick saddle thread and one of his old needles. It wasn't thread meant for clothes, but it held. "You shouldn't be up that long," he said as he set the wood down. "I'm not broken," she replied, not looking up. He almost smiled at that. "I saw smoke earlier," she added, nodding toward the west-facing window. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled back the curtain. A thin, steady wisp of smoke curled into the sky beyond the trees. "That's not a hunter's fire," he muttered. "Too clean." She met his gaze. "They're still searching." He didn't answer. Instead, he knelt by the cot, opened the old chest beneath it, and pulled out his weathered spyglass brass, dented but reliable. Stepping onto the porch, he raised it to the horizon. 2 horses stood tied beneath a rocky bluff, saddled and ready. No tents, no real camp. Just 2 men waiting near a dry stream bed, scanning the valley like hounds on a scent. He lowered the glass. "They're not from Silverknife." "No," Selu said. "They'll check the old trail next, then head into this valley." "How many came before?" he asked. 3. But only 1 gave orders. The others just followed. "Which one ambushed you?" She focused on her stitching. "All of them." He nodded quietly, placing the spyglass back in the chest. Later that afternoon, Nayati rode out to guide his cattle farther east, keeping them out of sight of the ridge. He worked silently, calm and deliberate, easing the herd into the lower corral. His rifle never left his back. When he returned, Selu had swept the floor using a bundle of sagebrush tied with a scrap of canvas. She sat near the stove, sipping warm broth. "I've lived here a long time," Nayati said as he stepped inside. "Never had cause to hide from men." She said nothing. "I'm not hiding now either," he added. "But if they come, I don't run." Her face remained steady, but her next words broke new ground. "My father will come," she said. "If they don't find me, they'll assume someone helped. We read signs. He'll see them." "You believe he'll find this place?" She nodded. "Before he was chief, he was a tracker." "He'll come." Nayati leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "That changes things." "How? If your father's close, and those men are still sniffing the hills, then these next few days are where it gets real dangerous." "I could ride out," she offered. "Take a horse disappear. Let the dust settle." He held her gaze. "You already know I won't do that." "You should," she said quietly. "They'll blame you." He shrugged. "I've carried blame before. Another stone won't break me." The silence between them wasn't strained. It was heavy with meaning. She set her cup down and adjusted her crutch. "You're not like the soldiers I've seen." "No," he said. "I'm not." That night, Nayati stacked more firewood by the door, then cleaned his rifle and revolver again. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. Selu sat close to the fire, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. Her face was calm, but her eyes sharp, as ever tracked every movement. Before lying down, she spoke again. "If my father comes, he won't offer open hands." "I wouldn't expect him to," Nayati said. "But he'll know what I've done. He'll see it." "I hope so." She looked over at him, her voice low and steady. "You could have left me in that river, but you didn't." "I don't leave people behind," he said. After that, neither looked away. And though no more words passed between them, the space in that small cabin no longer felt like it held 2 strangers. It felt like something beginning to hold. By the 3rd morning, frost traced delicate lace across the bottom edges of the window. The stove burned hot, and Nayati was already up splitting cedar to keep the heat steady. His boots moved soft across the worn floorboards, his rhythm unchanged. But now every small motion held a new awareness. He glanced over at the bed. Selu Rainbird was still asleep, but even in slumber she never looked fully at peace. Even when she slept, Selu Rainbird held herself like she might bolt at any moment. One hand always tucked beneath the blanket, her shoulders curled in like armor. Nayati Redhawk stepped outside his breath, turning to mist boots crunching softly over frozen dirt as he climbed the small rise behind the barn. The ridge where those 2 riders had shown up days ago was still there. Bare cottonwoods, stripped hills, Sky stretched wide, but no smoke this time. Just silence. He stood there a while, hand resting on his belt, eyes moving slow across the land. The cold stung his ears. Still, the feeling in his gut hadn't eased that quiet itch that told him something was out there. Watching. Waiting. By the time he came back inside, Selu was upright, crutches at her side. She'd finished mending her dress. Her hair was pulled back with a strip of old grain sack he'd tossed aside weeks ago. "You see anything?" she asked. "No riders, no smoke." "But it's too quiet," he said. "They've shifted," she murmured, "or they're watching from higher up." Nayati poured 2 cups of coffee and passed her one. She took it without a word. He sat across from her, staring into the steam, before he spoke what had lingered in his mind since she mentioned her father. "You said he'd come." She nodded once. "He will. When soon, unless they left a trail to mislead him. You trust him that much?" She met his gaze without flinching. "He's tracked soldiers through snow. Found children with nothing but scent. Pulled me out of a canyon once by spotting a scrap of my blanket." Nayati leaned back. "Then let's hope he's near." But she didn't look reassured. She looked torn. Her eyes flicked toward the window again. Again. "What is it?" he asked. "If he sees me here like this with you, he might think—" She trailed off. Nayati raised a hand. "I've been careful." "That's not it," she whispered. "It's that he won't understand why I stayed. You stayed because you're hurt. That's reason enough. I stayed," she said slower, "because you made me feel like I mattered." Those words hit like a hammer to the ribs. Nayati didn't answer right away. He hadn't asked for her trust, hadn't expected her to feel anything beyond safety. He'd just done what he thought was right, kept her warm, kept her breathing. But hearing her say it stirred something in him he wasn't ready to name. Heat flushed the back of his neck, not from the fire, but from something deeper. Before he could speak, Selu set down her cup, shifted and rose with her crutches. "I'm not going far today," she said, voice even. "You sure I won't make it far? But I need the air." Nayati opened the door without a word and held it for her. The wind hit them both sharp and cold, but she inhaled deep and straightened her shoulders as she stepped out. The frozen earth crunched beneath her feet. One crutch sunk slightly. She moved slow but steady, reaching halfway to the corral fence before stopping. She looked out across the land, chin-lifted, breath visible. Her dark hair caught in the breeze, cheeks flushed from the cold. Standing there, she looked different. Not like someone recovering, but someone refusing to be broken. Not a victim, just a woman still standing. "They'll come at dusk if they're close," she said. "That's when most men stop watching." "I'm not most men," he replied. "I know." That afternoon, Nayati reinforced the latches, braced the shutters not out of fear, but habit. Caution had kept him alive long after luck ran out. He checked the rifle, cleaned the chamber, counted the rounds. Inside, Selu sat by the fire, twisting willow bark into thread-thin cords. She didn't ask questions, didn't make noise, just worked. Then softly she said, "I was once promised." Nayati turned from the window. He was older. The council chose him. Respected. But not the man I wanted. "What happened?" she shrugged. "My father gave me the choice. I said no." Her voice didn't shake. "That doesn't happen often. My father isn't like most men." Nayati Red Hawk sat across from her, his elbows resting on the table, fingers laced together. "What do you think he'd say if he walked in right now and saw you here?" Selu Rainbird met his gaze without hesitation. "He'd say you're a man worth dying for." Something shifted in Nayati's chest. Not shock. Just a deep, quiet truth sinking in. He didn't know how to answer her. Outside, the wind whistled over the roof. The rafters groaned. Night had crept up faster than either of them realized. And they both knew this night would be different. Someone would come, and something, maybe everything, was about to change. The last of the sun was gone, swallowed by the cold, the kind that crawled into your bones quick this time of year. Nayati lit the lantern low, just enough to see without spilling shadows across the glass. He dropped the brace into place on the door and stoked the fire. The room glowed warm and quiet, but the tension between them remained. Selu sat stiffly, her hands resting gently on her crutches. She hadn't spoken much since earlier. Her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the darkness outside. "If they're coming," she finally said, "it'll be tonight." Nayati rolled his shoulders, loosening the tightness. The rifle had been checked. Twice. The pistol was loaded, sitting just above the coat hooks. He didn't want bloodshed, but he wouldn't be caught off guard. "They want you alive?" he asked. She gave a single nod. "For information. Routes. Names. Contacts I was meant to meet." His gaze didn't leave her. "You willing to give them that no?" Her answer came flat, cold. "They'll try, but I won't." He believed her. That same quiet grit, he'd seen it before, in men riding into battle knowing they might never return. Only this time it burned behind the eyes of a woman who could barely stand without help. "We could run," he said. "Ride east, cut through the basin, lose 'em past Sand Hollow." She didn't blink. "If I run, they'll follow. And you'll be hunted. You've already risked enough." He didn't argue, just nodded and stepped to the window. Then came the bark. They didn't have a dog. But the sharp sound, a single bark, wasn't wild. It was deliberate. A signal. Nayati moved to the door and eased it open an inch. The wind had stilled. Moonlight lay flat across the snow. Then movement. 3 shadows peeled away from the tree line. The man in front stepped into the open, a rifle slung across his back, and a pistol resting easy at his hip. The other 2 fanned out behind him, calm, confident, like they'd done this before. Nayati stepped onto the porch, closing the door quietly behind him. "Yubun," the lead man called. Nayati didn't respond. "Name's Sika Snakefang," the man said. "Me and my boys Waya Stormrunner and Hinto Longstep. We're from Ridge Supply. Got some business with a woman passed through here. Just want to check she's safe." Nayati stood still. "No fight intended," Sika added. "She's important. Carries weight in some delicate matters. We're here to escort her back where she belongs." Nayati's voice was dry as dirt. "You always ambush your business partners in the hills." Sika's smile faded. She ran. Took things she shouldn't. Now she's hurt, scared, confused. You did good taking her in, but we'll handle it from here. Nayati stepped down from the porch rifle in hand. Not raised, but not slung either. "She's not going anywhere with you." Sika cocked his head. "That your call to make Nayati didn't flinch. It is now." One of the men behind Sika shifted hand, grazing his holster. Nayati clocked it without moving his head. "I've buried worse men than you," he said calmly. "If you want to start something, I'm right here. But don't lie to me. This ain't no business trip." Sika took a slow breath. "You sure you want to die over some tribal girl?" Nayati Redhawk's jaw tightened. "That tribal girl has more honor in her bones than any 10 men like you," he said, voice like flint. Behind him, the cabin door gave a soft creak. Selu Rainbird stepped out into the cold, wrapped tight in a blanket crutches under her arms, standing tall despite everything. She didn't say a word. just stared down the three men with eyes that had seen too much. When Sika Snakefang spotted her, something in his face twitched, first recognition, then cold calculation. "You're not in any shape to run again, girl," he called out. Selu didn't flinch. "I'm not running. You really think that man can keep you safe? That he can take on everyone we send? I don't care." Sika let out a long breath through his nose. "All right then," he said, turning to the side. "We'll be back. And next time we won't waste time talking." Nayati didn't lower the rifle until they were gone, their horses fading into the dark like ghosts. He turned to her. "You shouldn't have come out. I had to." He moved beside her shoulder to shoulder, both staring into the still woods. "They'll come again," she said quietly. "I know. More of them." "Good." She looked up at him. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes followed the frosted horizon, then slowly dropped to meet hers. "Because you stayed," he said. "And I'm not letting anyone take that away from either of us." Inside the fire had burned low, but they didn't feel the cold. Not really. Nayati Redhawk didn't sleep that night. Not truly. He dozed in broken stretches, his back against the log wall near the stove rifle across his lap. Every groan of the old cabin snapped his eyes open. He fed 2 more logs to the fire. Let them burn slow. The lantern stayed low, just enough light not to cast silhouettes in the windows. Selu slept for a few hours. Her breathing stayed soft and steady, but her fingers never let go of the bone-handled knife he'd placed beside her bed. She hadn't asked for it. Didn't need to. Just the way she held it told him she understood exactly what might come with the dawn. Outside, the world held its breath. No wind, no hoofbeats, just the hush of winter pressing down. At first light, Nayati stepped out, rifle in hand, breath turning white in the air. Everything was still frozen. He moved slow up the ridge behind the barn, eyes sharp, scanning for any disturbance. Didn't take long. 3 sets of tracks horses. They'd circled the western bluff, then veered northeast, not heading back to town. Going deeper. This wasn't retreat. It was a new position. He crouched low, dragging his fingers across the churned-up snow. They'd left early before light, trying to hide their trail, but the frost hadn't reset. He'd been tracking men since before most of these boys had grown whiskers. The trail led to a patch of broken rock near the ridgetop, and there he saw it. A sign. 3 slashes carved into a young pine fresh, old signal code. Not just a warning, but a message for those who knew how to read it. Someone else had passed through here. He stared for a moment, then made his way back down Boots, careful mind racing. When he returned, Selu was already up, hobbling from table to stove, the blanket clutched around her shoulders. "You went looking," she said. "They're still nearby," he answered. "But they're not alone." She paused, eyes narrowing. "What did you see with 3 slashes in a pine? Clean and deep?" She gave a single nod. "It's a signal. For allies." He leaned the rifle against the wall. "Your father's close." A heavy silence settled between them. Not fear, just weight. Selu eased herself into the chair, her wounded leg stretched out. "He won't show himself. Not until he's certain." "He'll watch first," Nayati said. "Then let him," she replied. He boiled water poured into 2 tin cups, sat across from her. They drank in silence, the heat lingering between their hands. "You sure you want him coming here?" he asked. "I do. You think he'll take you home?" "I think. He'll ask what I want." That answer hit Nayati Redhawk harder than he expected. The fire in the stove gave a soft crackle. He looked down at his calloused hands blackened by oil and soot. "You don't have to go," he finally said, voice low. "I can't promise calm skies ahead, but I don't want you leaving just because you think you ought to." Selu Rainbird didn't respond right away. She simply watched him for a long moment. Then she whispered, "I know." The morning rolled on with the quiet rhythm of survival. Nayati fixed the loose hinge on the barn door, then cleared out the trough by the northern fence. Selu stripped sagebrush branches to dry for winter. She moved slow, favoring her wounded leg, but refused to sit idle. Around noon, the wind shifted. That's when Nayati smelled it campfire smoke, faint but certain. He froze, ears keen. Then he heard it, one rider, not fast, not sneaky, just steady hooves pressing through brittle leaves. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out the front door. He didn't aim it, just held it easy across his arms. From the tree line came a lone figure riding slow on a roan stallion. Tall, braided hair wrapped in leather bone charms and feathers dangling from his shoulder. Eyes sharp as cut obsidian. Face unreadable. Takoda Iron Horse. Nayati knew the name from stories passed between men who rode long distances. An Apache war chief who never bowed to treaties. A man who'd buried 2 sons thanks to whiskey traders, but still never raised war against nearby settlers. A leader other men respected, even if they didn't understand him. Takoda didn't dismount at first. Selu stepped onto the porch, still on crutches wrapped in a blanket. At the sight of her, Takoda's expression shifted just barely. Then he climbed down slow, his boots crunching in the frost. He walked to her first. They said nothing. His eyes scanned her wounds, her limp, the cabin behind her. Then he looked at Nayati. The 2 men stood still. "You found her?" Takoda asked. "I pulled her from the river," Nayati replied. "You helped her. I fed her, mended her wounds, kept her safe." Takoda studied him, not just the words, but the weight behind them. His posture, his voice, the grit in his stance. "Why? Because no one else would." Takoda turned to his daughter, then back again. "She stayed." "I didn't ask her to," Nayati said, voice firm. "But I'm damn glad she did." Silence. Then the chief moved to his saddle and drew out a wrapped bundle. He unfolded it with care. A beaded pouch, a hand-woven blanket, and a carved piece of wood bearing tribal markings. He placed it gently in Selu's hands. "You were free," he told her, his voice thick with meaning. "And never forgotten." She held it with both hands. Then he turned to Nayati, speaking not as a threat, but as a father laying truth down like stone. "If she stays with you, your name is hers now, not for hiding from meaning." Nayati understood. It wasn't about protection. It was about belonging. Without another word, Takoda mounted his horse and rode back into the forest. They didn't speak until he vanished. Then Selu looked to Nayati, voice soft as morning mist. "I don't need to go back, not unless I choose to, and I choose this." Nayati didn't speak. He reached for the pouch in her hands, brushed a thumb across the beadwork. "Then we build something here," he said. "I want that." Just then, sunlight split through the clouds, pouring gold across the clearing. For the first time in years, Nayati Redhawk felt like he was stepping into something new, not running from something lost. The air felt changed, not peaceful, but different. The tension that had cloaked the cabin like fog finally lifted. 2 days had passed since Takoda Iron Horse rode out. No riders returned. No strangers lingered. No tracks in the snow near the edge of the property. Just frost-bitten dawns, and a new rhythm between two souls, learning to share a space no longer haunted. Nayati had not lived with anyone since the day he buried Aelin Moonfeather and a Huli Grey Cub. Not like this. But Selu wasn't filling a hole. She was changing the very shape of the space. That morning he rose just after first light, drawn by the scent of pine and split wood. He found her sitting beneath the eave, wrapped in a blanket crutches leaning beside her. Her fingers worked steadily weaving bark into tight cordage. And for the first time in a long while, he let himself believe in the future. Her face tilted toward the sun rising just over the hills. "You sleep?" Nayati Redhawk asked as he stepped onto the porch. She didn't turn. Some Selu rainbird replied, her voice soft. He gave a single nod, then stepped down off the porch and grabbed the hatchet. Morning chores didn't wait on conversations or emotions. He spent the next hour mending the fence along the southern slope. One of the posts had rotted clear through over winter. He dug it out and planted a fresh cedar beam he'd shaved smooth weeks ago. It was the kind of job he usually did in silence alone. But not today. Selu stood at the tree line watching him. She didn't crowd or comment, just stood steady on her good leg and handed him a spool of wire right when he needed it. Later they walked back toward the cabin side by side. No rush, no chatter. Just the quiet rhythm of two people moving through the same space. Inside, she stirred beans over the stove, while Nayati shaped the last pieces of a new bench. Her movements had settled into something sure. Now slow, but full of purpose. The limp barely showed anymore. By nightfall, her ankle still swelled, but it no longer seemed to define her. She moved like someone with plans. "What will you do come spring?" she asked suddenly, looking up. "Same thing I do every spring," Nayati said. "Fix the roof. Maybe slap some paint on the trim if I'm feeling ambitious. No plans to go anywhere." He chuckled once. "Leave for what?" "This here. This is it." She nodded. "It could be mine, too." He didn't answer right away, just watched her ladle beans into two dented tin bowls. Then he stepped closer and took one from her hands. "It already is," he said. They sat at the rough wooden table, the way they had every meal since she'd come, shoulders relaxed, heads bowed slightly over steam rising from the bowls. After lunch, Selu surprised him. "I want to help with the animals." Nayati raised an eyebrow. "The cattle." She nodded. "You ever worked one before? I've watched enough men mess it up," she said dryly. "I can learn." He didn't argue. Instead, they headed out to the corral as the afternoon sun finally cracked through the cloud cover for good. The cattle stirred lazily, hooves crunching over patches of melting snow as they moved toward the feed troughs. Selu leaned on the fence, watching him work his hand along the back of one older steer. "They're simple," Nayati said. "They want warmth water feed, and peace." She looked at him. "Not so different from people." "Some people," he replied, glancing back at her. That evening after the sun slipped behind the far ridge, they sat in front of the fire again. The scent of wood smoke, hot iron, and a trace of boiled sage filled the air. She'd laid an old blanket over the bench, clean and warm. He stacked more split wood along the wall. Neither spoke for a while. Then she turned to him. "What was her name?" Nayati looked into the fire. The flames danced across worn floorboards, casting long orange shadows. "Aelin. My wife. You loved her?" He nodded slowly. "More than I knew how to say back then. And now?" He took in a breath, quiet and steady. I don't think love dies when someone does. It just waits until it finds somewhere new to live. She didn't look away. Has it found that now? He turned his eyes to her, held her gaze. Maybe it had. If you'll let it. Selu rose and came to sit on the floor beside his chair, her back resting gently against his knee. She didn't reach for him. She didn't need to. That night, no one said goodnight. The silence between them was full, and for the first time, it was enough. Outside, the snow began again, light as ash. But inside the cabin, the warmth held steady. And for the first time since the river, Selu Rainbird fell asleep, without the knife in her hand. The last frost passed quiet. No storm, no warning. Just a slow warming of the ground, the sound of meltwater trickling again through the river's edge. Snow pulled back from the ridgeline in patches. Mud took its place. The trees began to shift, barely noticeable at first, but unmistakably alive. Nayati Redhawk stood leaning on the porch post, hat in hand, eyes on the horizon. The scent of pine, fresh sap, and wet earth filled the air. It had been nearly 3 months since he'd pulled her from that river. 3 months since silence turned into something else, something neither of them had been looking for. She was behind him now, inside the cabin, folding blankets and sorting through the last of the winter furs. Her ankle could bear full weight. She moved carefully still, but the limp had all but disappeared. The tattered dress she'd arrived in had been replaced with one she'd chosen. She had fashioned her dress from salvaged canvas and scraps of cloth, dyed with crushed berries and ash. It wasn't pretty, but it was sturdy, humble, and wore on her like her silence did, with quiet resolve. They hadn't spoken about what came next, not directly, but neither had to. 2 weeks back, Dakota Ironhorse had come again alone this time. He arrived with the first light, gave Nayati Redhawk a single nod, then stepped into the cabin like it was already his home. He sat with Selu Rainbird for nearly an hour, while Nayati split wood out back, pretending not to listen. When Dakota stepped outside, he handed Nayati a bundle wrapped tight in buckskin. Inside was a small carved token, white pine, her tribal crest etched across it, a crescent along the rim. For protection, Dakota said. Not from danger from doubt. That night, Selu told him quietly, "He knows I'm not going back." And that was all. Now, with spring softening the hills, Nayati stepped back into the cabin and paused. He hadn't realized it until that moment how much the place had changed, how alive it felt. The fire still crackled, but now it was more than heat. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. Woven reed baskets lined the shelves. A bone-handled knife lay beside a sewing kit. This wasn't survival anymore. It was home. He picked up the rolled packet on the table, the one he'd prepared in town, and handed it to her. She unrolled the thick parchment eyes, skimming the inked words. "What is it?" she asked, though her voice already knew. "Land deed," he said. "Filed under both our names." She blinked. "You went to the county office last Thursday," he nodded. "Got a Tohi Ravenmark to witness it. You didn't ask me." He gave a shrug. "Didn't think I had to." She folded the paper, slowly, steady hands. Set it back on the table. "You didn't," she said. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of breath of warmth, of something finally clicking into place. That afternoon, Nayati hitched up the wagon. 2 feed sacks, a crate of seed, and a box wrapped in brown paper. Selu climbed aboard without a word, a basket in her lap. Inside, 2 folded blankets, a tin of beans, and a wooden carving Nayati had made last week, a flat oval piece with one word etched into it: home. They rolled down the trail into Silverknife, through the creek crossing, and out past the old line shack. Folks watched them from shaded porches and dusty windows, not cruelly, just curious. The man who kept to himself now riding beside a woman nobody ever expected to stay. They didn't wave. Neither did she. At the general store, Nayati tied the wagon, carried the box. She waited at the stoop with her basket. They stepped inside together. Enoli Swiftwind, the clerk, paused mid-reckoning when he saw them. He had a pencil behind one ear and eyes that didn't miss much. "You bring the deed with you?" he asked. Nayati handed it over. Enoli scanned it, stamped it, signed it. "That's that, then," he said. "Land's yours, joint name." Filed under Red Hawk, and he hesitated, looking up. Selu held his gaze. "Rainbird," she said. Enoli nodded, returned the deed. No questions asked. They left without another word. Back at the cabin, dusk came gentle. Selu pinned a strip of cloth across the window. Nayati stirred the stew. The old blanket she once wore now lay folded at the foot of the bed. The carving rested on the shelf above the door. They didn't speak much during supper, but afterward by the fire she moved beside him, laid her hand on his. Rough to rough, solid. "You gave me more than my life back," she said. He turned eyes soft. "You gave me a reason to stay." That night she didn't sleep across the room. They shared the cot. Not with haste, not with heat, but with closeness born of choice. 2 lives, stitched together not by fate, but by will. Outside wind rustled the pines. Inside, no words were needed. And when morning came warm and golden across the ridges, they were still there. Together. Home. The end.